tells us. But where's the food plan? Where's the food white paper that reflects the foresight challenges? Now, I'm not sitting here talking about a Soviet-style grand plan led from Whitehall. I understand, and I think farmers everywhere appreciate the fact that those days are over. But unless there's something more substantial, more thought through, than a one-line objective in DEFRA's business plan, it's difficult to see how we're going to start reversing the trend lines on those graphs behind me. One of the key messages from the foresight is the urgency of all of this. You, Secretary of State, said by video link last week at the Soil Association conference that the report makes a strong case for the future of food being the most urgent question facing this generation. And I have to say that you're in good company. I took the opportunity of looking back at what the Prime Minister said when he spoke at our conference in 2008. He was at the time, of course, leader of the opposition. He talked a lot about food security. He flagged up our growing dependence on food imports and said, I quote, "Government needs to strip away those barriers to successful domestic food and farming that stand in the way of delivering and achieving greater food security." He talked about the risk of the UK depending on food imports at a time when the days of abundant food from around the world may well be coming to an end. Really significantly, he talked about ranking food security alongside energy security and even national security. Please, now you're in the hot seat, now you're in government, don't let this slide from view. People often ask me and want us to put a number on self-sufficiency. We can't put a number on it. But what we are prepared to do is commit our own resources to work with other organisations such as BBSRC, AHDB, for example, to map out what reversing the trend on this graph might look like. Whether getting back to levels of the early 1990s, for example, is even doable. What would it take in terms of research, investment, skills, new development, adoption of new technology, changes in farm practices? And can we do it sustainably? So my first call to the government today is this. Let's at least do that. We know it's a really complex issue. So let's look at the work done by the Fruit and Veg Task Force over the last couple of years. And let's broaden it out to cover all our primary foodstuffs and harness the best research brains to get a real picture of what's needed to change the direction. Again, I repeat myself, these critical two lines. Secretary of State, we need more than just a biodiversity white paper, more than just a water white paper. To bring all the foresight challenges together, we need a food plan. Two more brief points on what we're looking for from the government here in the UK following the foresight report, and where we need DEFRA to pitch into other government departments across the whole of government office. First, increasing domestic food production won't happen without development at a local level, down on our farms. Most of that will need local planning consent, and that's something we worry a lot about. A narrow localist agenda could put the brakes on the growth we need. We need state-of-the-art polytunnels critical to the success of the soft fruit industry, high-output glasshouses for vegetables, the latest lower-carbon, high-welfare pig, poultry and other livestock units. That's why it's absolutely critical the government has food production as one of the strategic priorities in the new national planning framework. If it doesn't, NIMBYism will win the day. Secretary of State, we really need your support in this area. Finally, on the domestic front, we urgently need to see some concrete action on the groceries code adjudicator. The Foresight Group, and I've already touched on it, talked about fair and functioning markets being the best way to ensure food security. I don't need to rehearse the arguments again. The Competition Commission's done that many times. But I do know that supermarkets will be lobbying like mad to get this kicked into the long grass. Secretary of State, we need, again, for you to fight for us on this and win the battle. It's all very well for the retailers, and I saw Stephen Robertson on the front page of the business section of the Telegraph last week saying how the retailers were taking a hit for their customers. I was staggered by those words. Try telling that to one of my fresh produce members who's just received a massive rebate demand from one of his members at the BRC. And we need more than just naming and shaming, as is currently proposed. Secretary of State, we need fines that hurt for abuses that hurt. And while I'm still on fair and functioning markets, that brings me to Europe. I want to first touch on the dairy sector. We simply cannot go on with milk producers being squeezed out of existence in these insane processor retailer wars that are currently being waged. We all know something's got to be done. The EU says something's got to be done. I was on a platform in December with Jim Pace in Devon, and he heard firsthand of the problems. And I know he's frustrated by what's going on as well. Let me again urge you to get behind the Commission's proposal for changes to milk contracts and rebalancing the bargaining power of farmers. We know it won't be a panacea by any means, but it's a much-needed step towards stopping the exploitation of so many dairy farmers and their families that's happening right now as I stand here. My second example, still on the fair and functioning markets, our egg producers have invested heavily in enriched cages ahead of next January's deadline. We estimate over 400 million has been invested. That's the equivalent of over 15 brand new schools. And the egg producers have done the right thing. Other EU producers haven't. Yet unless the government and the European Commission take action, illegal eggs will still be able to be sold here in the UK and undercut our own producers. Secretary of State, we acknowledge that you've already given us support on this so far. And I know it's not going to be easy to find ways to stop these illegal eggs and egg products coming into the UK. But we really do need the government and the Commission to demonstrate that when producers put themselves on the line to meet new welfare standards, they don't end up being screwed by unfair competition. We've been here before, I'm afraid to say. We've got examples in the pig sector when they were banned stalls and tethers, regulation brought in by, I'm afraid to say, the previous Conservative government. And that was instrumental in halving the size of the UK pig industry. And I have to confess, the rest of the EU still hasn't caught up on this welfare regulation yet. My last point wants to be about Europe, and I'd like to say something about the government's ambitions for CAP reform. Secretary of State, I have to be really honest with you now and say that farmers have been profoundly worried by the reports of what you've been saying about the CAP. And I'd be doing them a big disservice to them if I didn't ask some urgent questions about the government's stance. Questions that I hope you'll be able to give us some assurance on this morning. I know that Ellen Jones has made no bones about her government's reaction to what you said at Oxford earlier this year. And I have to say I agree with her. Right now, and you know the figures too, direct payments are essential to the viability of farming in Wales and in England. What farmers are asking me as I go around the country in the last few weeks is whether your government is going to be the one that actually implements the 2005 DEFRA Treasury vision for CAP. To be honest, with what you said at Oxford about the world prices making it possible to plan for the abolition of direct payments, it's difficult to see from the outside there has been a change of policy in this area. So let me be clear about where I believe we as farmers want to be. We do want to get to a place where we're less reliant on public support. We do want to be able to compete with efficient operators from elsewhere. But we're not there yet. I've given you examples of where the markets don't work, whether because of unfair competition or because of imbalances of power in the supply chain. I have to say, Secretary of State, I believe you've got this the wrong way round. Ending subsidies won't miraculously make the markets work. Unless and until this is sorted out, and unless we drive competitiveness, manage volatility, producers at the sharp end of the food chain have no chance of going it alone. Let me also be clear about where we are on the budget. We recognise the strains that national budgets are under across Europe. Of course we do. It would be foolish to expect that the CAP budget not to be re-examined in the light of all of the challenges we face. But I'd also like to make this one other point. Vital science programme spending has been protected from the worst of the cuts in the UK, and rightly so. It's our future. It's our only hope to meeting those future challenges. Secretary of State, if the Foresight Report tells us anything, it tells us that now is the time for a strong, common, critically agricultural policy. I urge you to bear that in mind when you talk about substantial cuts to the budget. So in conclusion, I have to acknowledge this has been one of my hardest conference speeches, because I've had to balance up the positives of a new government that so many of my members have welcomed against the potential negatives, which I've just touched on around the CAP. But to sum up, what I am saying is that Foresight puts farming at the centre of the big challenges of the future. So when the government talks about global food security being the most urgent question facing this generation, make UK farmers part of the answer. When you talk about the need for functioning markets, it isn't just about export bans from abroad, it's about deeply flawed supply chains and unfair competition right here in the UK. When the Prime Minister talks about investing in industries of the future, make sure he has farming and agriculture research on his list. Let us know that you're standing up not just around the cabinet table, but around the negotiating table in Europe as well. That's what we as farmers want to see. It's right that agriculture is the place that Dan Glickman says it should have, at the top of the agenda. And Secretary of State, we at the NFU want to help you put it there. Before I hand over and finally wind up, that despite the massive challenges, despite the concerns of the livestock sector, the abusive practices that I've talked about, I do believe the underlying mood here today is positive, even upbeat for many, because farming is back on the agenda. The world needs much more sustainably produced food, and we as an industry are up for the challenge. I'm hoping you have a great 2 days, because this conference is how we meet that challenge. Thank you very much.